The air over the Arizona Territory in the late summer of 1883 was not merely hot, it was a physical weight, pressing the moisture from a man's bones and turning the fine red dust into a suffocating presence. Elias Vance, squinting through the brass sight of his transit, wiped a bead of sweat that instantly drew a clean line down his grime-streaked cheek. He was a surveyor, a man whose entire purpose was to translate the wild, uncompromising landscape into neat black lines on parchment. He carved up the future, but standing here, on the edge of the Chiricoa Mountains, with the sun beating down like a forge, the future felt less like a measured path and more like a high-speed collision. Elias wasn't charting some dusty claim line. He was mapping the final, brutal stretch for the Great Western Pacific Railroad. The line was a ravenous beast, swallowing distance and spitting out civilization, wealth, and inevitably, conflict. "Station 47, sight locked," he called out, his voice hoarse. 100 yards down the ridge, his assistant, a lanky young man named Finn, with a perpetually anxious gaze, dutifully hammered the chain pin into the sun-baked earth. The clink of the hammer was swallowed instantly by the vast, thirsty silence. Finn hiked back up, breathing hard. "Mr. Vance, we're 2 hours past midday. The water's low and the shadows are getting long on the canyon side. Maybe we should pack it up before—" He trailed off, gesturing vaguely toward the looming rust-colored canyon walls that plummeted into the San Pedro Valley below. Elias lowered the transit. The lens had captured the shimmer of heat, making the distant horizon look like rippling water. "Before what, Finn? Before we prove the engineers back east wrong? Before we confirm this is the last practical route to the Pacific coast? Before the locals decide they don't much appreciate 1,000 miles of steel being laid through their backyard," Finn muttered, his eyes darting. Elias smiled, but the expression was tight. He knew what Finn meant. This stretch of land, known locally as the Serpent's Coil, was not empty. It was the ancestral hunting ground of the Apache, who had fought every inch of American progress with a ferocity that had earned them a terrible, bloody reputation. And more recently, it was home to a fiercely independent, mostly Irish community of prospectors and ranchers who viewed the railroad as the death knell of their solitude. "The railroad pays for protection, Finn, and we have Captain Thorne's men 2 days behind us," Elias said, trying to sound more convinced than he felt. Thorne and his crew of hired Pinkerton agents and former soldiers were heavy-handed, quick to violence, and entirely focused on protecting the company's property, namely Elias's survey crew. He turned his back on the valley to check his notes, reviewing the complex calculation for the maximum grade into the valley floor. He needed to find a gentle enough slope for a train, which was asking the mountain to compromise. Whoosh! A sound, not of wind, but of displacement. Elias felt the air pressure change an inch from his ear. He froze. Finn, who had been refilling his canteen, gasped, dropping the metal flask. It hit a rock and tumbled down the slope, rattling emptily. Lying neatly on Elias's worn leather notebook, pinning the page open, was a pristine arrow. It was fletched with 2 dark feathers, hawk perhaps, and its head was chipped obsidian, clearly not government issue or a prospector's relic. It hadn't been fired with malice, or it would have skewered his skull. It had been placed with a warning. Elias picked up the arrow. The shaft was smooth, cool despite the heat. He whispered, "A gift." Finn's face was white beneath the dust. "That wasn't a gift, Mr. Vance. That was a sentence. They were right there. How did we not hear them?" Elias looked at the point where the arrow must have come from. A small, dark outcrop of granite barely 300 yards away, perfectly hidden against the harsh texture of the canyon walls. A marksman could have picked them off easily. This was a demonstration of absolute proximity and lethal intent. He felt a primal mod of fear and something else, professional respect, the silent approach, the precision. He said, "We heard nothing because they didn't want us to." His voice was now low and calm. He stuffed the arrow into his saddlebag, not as a souvenir, but as a piece of evidence. "Pack the gear, Finn. Every chain, every tripod. We calculate the tangent point here, and we leave now." They moved with urgent, contained energy, the rhythm of their packing frantic yet efficient. As Elias wrapped the heavy, precise brass instruments, he looked one last time at the canyon. He saw it then, not a warrior, not a prospector, but a faint, almost invisible heat shimmer of movement high on the granite outcrop, a silhouette tall and lean, utterly motionless against the dizzying backdrop. It was too far to distinguish features, but the posture held a stillness Elias had only ever seen in predators or men who had spent their lives observing the desert's unforgiving rules. It was a man watching them go, a man who had just told the Great Western Pacific Railroad via a single silent shaft of wood and stone that this line was drawn in blood. He mounted his aging mare, the leather creaking under his weight. Finn scrambled onto his mule. "Which way, sir?" Finn asked, his hand resting nervously on the pistol holstered to his hip. Elias glanced at his compass, then at the ridge behind him. The logical, company-approved route was to follow the surveyed line back east to meet Thorne's patrol. The watcher on the outcrop would expect that. Elias spurred the mare west toward the unmapped, contested valley floor, the very place the arrow had warned him away from. "We're going to find out why that arrow was fired, Finn. We're going to survey the heart of the serpent's coil. If the railroad is going to run here, I need to know every secret this canyon holds. And that means we're going to meet the people who don't want this track laid." He leaned into the hot wind, the dust plume rising behind them like a record warning sign. Elias Vance was no fighter, just a man of numbers, but he had just accepted a direct challenge from the wild heart of the American West. And challenges, for men like Elias, were simply problems that needed to be solved with more dangerous measurements. They rode toward the setting sun, where the shadows of the Chiricahua stretched long and menacing, swallowing the trail whole. The iron horse was coming, but the land was not yet broken. The descent into the serpent's coil was a grueling exercise in self-preservation. Elias and Finn were forced to dismount and lead their horses down a switchback trail so narrow and littered with loose shale that one slip would send man and beast tumbling into the abyss. The shadows that had been menacing shapes in the distance were now concrete walls, trapping the air and magnifying the scent of dry pine and alkali dust. By the time they reached the canyon floor, the last sliver of sunlight had vanished, replaced by the bruised purple of deep twilight. Elias, his knees aching and his nerves frayed, suddenly smelled something that cut through the desert air: wood smoke, wet earth, and the metallic tang of raw copper. The floor of the canyon, which looked like an impenetrable wall from above, opened into a small, chaotic pocket of human industry. It wasn't a town, but a desperate camp clinging to the banks of a shallow, sluggish creek. Canvas tents huddled next to shacks of rough-hewn cedar, punctuated by the dull glow of forge fires and the rhythmic clang of a hammer against steel. This was a prospector's community, a transient, dangerous settlement built entirely on a fleeting dream of fortune. Elias saw no sign of the Apache, but he saw plenty of angry, watchful faces, men mostly Irish and Cornish, who paused their work to stare at the two outsiders with survey equipment. Elias ignored them and headed toward the largest structure, a long, low building of split logs with a single battered sign crudely painted, "The Copper Queen." It served as both a saloon and an assay office. As they approached, a figure emerged from the Queen's dark doorway. It wasn't one of the rough-looking men who'd been watching them. It was a woman, and the moment Elias saw her, he understood why Finn was so nervous about the locals. She stood tall, dressed in durable denim trousers and a leather vest, her dark hair pulled back severely, revealing a face tanned and weathered, but undeniably striking. She carried a Winchester lever-action rifle, held loosely but expertly across her chest, and her posture was one of absolute, unyielding proprietorship. "You're lost," she stated, her voice carrying a deep, gravelly quality that spoke of years shouting over mule teams and mining blasts. "The railroad don't run through here yet, so you boys have no business trespassing on private property." Elias stepped forward, lifting his hand slightly to show he was unarmed, save for the pistol holstered under his coat. "Elias Vance, Great Western Pacific Survey. We are required to assess the feasibility of a cut-and-fill route through the San Pedro Valley, ma'am." She didn't move. Her eyes, sharp and the color of polished slate, assessed him with clinical efficiency. "Feasibility, right. My name is Serafina Cole. I run this camp, and the feasibility of your route depends entirely on whether or not you enjoy breathing our air, Mr. Vance." Finn swallowed hard, his face pale. Elias reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the obsidian-tipped arrow. He held it up to the dim light spilling from the saloon door. "Then perhaps you can explain the feasibility of this," Elias said, his voice even. "It was left for me on Station 47 about an hour after noon, a warning to turn back. I am here because I do not take my orders from Fletching and Stone, Miss Cole." Serafina's expression, previously hostile, became guarded. She lowered the rifle slightly, but her fingers remained near the trigger guard. "That wasn't one of mine," she said flatly. "My boys use lead. But the meaning is clear enough. It's what you were warned about. Get out." "I can't. The company is committed. They will send Captain Thorne's mercenaries after me, and if I turn up dead, they'll send Thorne anyway. If I tell them this canyon is impassable, they'll run the track further north, and it will cost them millions. They will not thank me for saving them money. They will demand proof." He took a step closer. "You need to know why this canyon is more trouble than a mountain range. Is it your copper claim? If the railroad buys you out, will you leave?" A harsh laugh escaped Serafina. "Buy us out? Mr. Vance, the proposed route, your little survey lines, run directly over the mouth of the Copper Queen mine, the deepest vein we've hit. They want to bury us under their ballast and steel for a straight run. This isn't about compensation. This is about survival." She jabbed the rifle barrel toward the north ridge, the way Elias had come. "The railroad line will obliterate everything we've built, and we won't let them." Elias nodded, storing the information. "Understood. But you said the arrow wasn't one of yours. Whose was it?" Serafina paused, a flicker of something close to genuine fear crossing her eyes before she masked it with toughness. She glanced up at the towering, jagged peaks surrounding them, the serpent's coil. "There are two kinds of people who don't want that railroad laid here, Vance. Us, who will fight you for the dirt under your feet, and the others, who don't fight for dirt, but for the soul of the land. That arrow was Apache, probably a Chiricahua scout." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper that commanded Elias's full attention. "They've been quiet for nearly a year. A truce, a brittle peace we hammered out with them so we could work the claim and they could hunt on their traditional ground. That truce is built on one rule: don't bring in the white man's army and don't draw the attention of the East." She pointed the rifle at his brass transit, still strapped to the horse. "You, your chains, your lines, and the 1,000 men that follow you, that is the East. You bring Captain Thorne and his gunslingers through here, and you shatter that peace. The Apache will treat the railroad men as invaders, and they will butcher them. They'll butcher us, too, for letting you in." She stepped back, the fierce light of the forge fires reflecting in her eyes. "So you're here for feasibility? Here is your finding. The Serpent's Coil is feasible for a mine, but not for a war. You tell your superiors to reroute, or the next arrow you see won't be a warning, and it won't be fired by a prospector." Elias looked from Serafina to the forbidding peaks above. The initial warning he received was a simple, "Go away." Serafina's warning was complex. The railroad would not just destroy her community, it would unleash a retaliatory war that would cost the railroad its entire investment and countless lives. He slipped the arrow back into his bag. "I thank you for your honesty, Miss Cole. I will record everything you've told me. You do that, and then you ride out before sunrise. If you're here when the sun hits the rim, I'll assume you're not a surveyor looking for feasibility, but a spy looking for a grave." He nodded, knowing he had just met his most dangerous ally and his fiercest opponent. He had proof of the conflict, the arrow, and now he had the motive and the stakes. The problem was no longer just mapping a route, it was navigating a war he had unwittingly started. The camp was a sleeping beast, shrouded in the sickly silver light of a waning moon. The forge fires had banked down to a dull, throbbing orange, and the only sounds were the distant rush of the creek and the occasional groan of the mine shaft timbers shifting in the cool night. Elias had hidden their horses and equipment far up a side ravine. He looked at Finn, who was trembling, his face a ghostly mask in the moonlight. "Sunrise is 3 hours off," Elias whispered, checking the time on his pocket watch, a precision instrument that seemed ridiculously out of place in this hostile wilderness. "We need proof that will hold up against the Great Western Pacific's lawyers. Not just a claim, but data. Hard, undeniable facts." "She'll shoot us, Mr. Vance," Finn pleaded, his eyes wide. "If we're caught near that mine, Serafina Cole will think we're staking a claim, not taking a measurement." "Then we won't get caught," Elias said, though his own heart hammered against his ribs. He carried only a small canvas bag containing a heavy brass plumb bob, 100 feet of thin marked cord, and a lamp shielded by thick glass. These were the tools of his trade, and tonight they felt like instruments of espionage. The scent of copper and gunpowder grew stronger as they crept toward the mine's main portal, a gaping timber-framed hole near the back of the saloon. Elias signaled Finn to wait behind a stack of empty ore carts, his rifle ready. Elias slid forward, his boots crunching silently on the pulverized tailings. He reached the mine mouth. The air pouring out of the shaft was cold and smelled of deep earth and mineral wealth. This was the Copper Queen, the vein that Serafina Cole said would be buried under 10,000 tons of railroad ballast. He opened his lamp shield just enough to illuminate the shaft. It was a narrow, vertical drop. A winch house sat nearby, its chain slung over the wheel. Working with the practiced urgency of a man who measured his life by accuracy, Elias tied the marked cord to the heavy brass plumb bob. This was his evidence. By measuring the true vertical depth and grade of the vein, he could estimate the capital expenditure already invested. The cost of burying this mine would far outweigh the cost of a detour. He carefully lowered the plumb bob into the shaft, paying out the cord, hand over agonizing hand, counting every painted footmark as it disappeared into the dark. 10 feet, 20, 30,
The cord seemed to vanish into a bottomless pit. He was focused entirely on the measurement, counting the marks under his breath, when a voice, sharp and dangerously close, cut through the night. "A surveyor's instrument is heavier than a prayer book, Vance, and I don't take kindly to thieves preying on my land." Elias froze, his hand still holding the cord. Seraphina Cole stood 10 feet away, her Winchester leveled, the moonlight glinting off the barrel. She hadn't come from the saloon, but from a small, dark side entrance to the mountain itself, perhaps a secondary claim office carved into the rock. "I told you to be gone by morning," she said, her voice a low, lethal purr. Elias slowly straightened up, raising his empty hands. "I am not staking a claim, Miss Cole. I am measuring a fact that will save your mine and perhaps save us all from Captain Thorne." "And you think the size of my hole is going to stop the richest railroad in the territory?" she scoffed. "It will stop them if the cost of burying this hole is greater than the cost of a rerouting," Elias countered. "I need the depth, and I need to know the estimate of the yield, Miss Cole, not just copper, but what else you're pulling out." She hesitated, her finger twitching near the trigger. This pause was the only window Elias needed. "It's gold, isn't it?" Elias pressed. "A gold strike deep down in the copper vein. That's why you're building deep, and that's why you're willing to fight a railroad. If I can prove the existence of an independent gold strike in the Serpent's Coil, no judge in the West will let the Great Western Pacific bury it without paying an impossible price." A muscle twitched in Seraphina's jaw. Elias knew he had hit the truth. She looked around the sleeping camp. The fear in her eyes was not for her own life, but for the secret of the gold strike. Twump, twump. The sound was subtle, but terrifyingly distinct. 2 soft, low drum beats echoing faintly from the high, jagged peaks of the coil's rim. It was not the rhythmic, cheerful music of the camp. It was a communication. Seraphina's head snapped up. Her attention left Elias instantly. She recognized the sound. "They're closer than they should be," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. "That's not a scout signal. That's a sentry warning. They know you're here, Vance. They know the piece is broken." She lowered the rifle slightly, abandoning the standoff. "The gold, it's not even mined yet. It's just assayed ore, but the proof is in the ledger." She backed quickly toward the dark side entrance she had emerged from, waving Elias to follow. "You want data? I'll give you data, but we have 30 minutes before the sun hits the rim and the riders start moving." Elias quickly pulled the plumb bob up, reeling the cord in furiously. He hadn't finished the measurement, but the cord was marked at 93 feet. That was enough to confirm a massive investment. He snatched the plumb bob and followed Seraphina into the earthen side entrance. It led not to a tunnel, but to a small, cool chamber carved directly out of the mountain. Inside, on a rough wooden desk, sat a heavy, oil-stained ledger. "The assay reports, the geological maps, the daily logs, it's all there," she said, pointing. "It details the purity of the quartz, the tonnage, the projected value. It proves this mine is worth more than their entire stretch of track." Elias didn't hesitate. He tore the central pages out, the summary sheets, and the hand-drawn geological map of the deepest vein. He folded the thick paper and tucked it securely inside the lining of his coat. "Thank you, Miss Cole. I will use this to detour the line. I swear I won't reveal the gold's location unnecessarily, only its value." "Get out, Elias Vance," Seraphina commanded, her slate eyes burning with desperate energy. "And if you fail, if that iron horse comes through here, I will hunt you down myself." Elias ran back out into the pre-dawn chill. He grabbed Finn, who was a tight ball of anxious energy behind the ore carts. "We have the proof. Ride hard and ride north. We're heading for Captain Thorne's patrol. We have to beat the Apache to him, or the first thing Thorne sees will be a battlefield." They scrambled up the ravine. Elias glanced back as they reached the lip of the ridge. A faint silver-blue light was just beginning to appear on the horizon, painting the jagged peaks in a terrible, beautiful dawn. They were leaving the Serpent's Coil just as the sun and the conflict were rising. They rode north toward the organized violence of the railroad's mercenaries, armed with nothing but a folded map and the desperate hope that a single piece of evidence could stop an inevitable war. The clock was running out.
The rising sun did not bring comfort. It brought visibility. Elias and Finn rode as if pursued by the devil himself, their horses lathered and their lungs burning with the sharp, dusty air. They had fled the Serpent's Coil, but they were still trapped by the consequences of their visit. Elias glanced behind them. In the distance, silhouetted sharply against the blinding red glare of the sun on the high ridge, he saw the faint movement he had feared. Not a dozen riders, but two solitary figures following their dust trail with the unwavering persistence of wolves. They were Chiricahua trackers, and they were not chasing Elias. They were herding him. "They're pacing us, Finn," Elias shouted over the pounding hoofs. "They're not trying to stop us. They're driving us directly into Thorn." Elias realized the terrible strategy. The Apache knew Thorn and his men were predictable, following the surveyed line. By leading the surveying party directly into the patrol, the Apache would ensure the confrontation happened on terrain of their choosing, a canyon choke point or an isolated clearing, and at a time when Thorn's guard was down. "We have to reach them first. We have to warn them." Elias urged his mare forward, though the animal was near collapse. They found the advance guard of Captain Thorn's patrol just as the sun cleared the mountains. The patrol consisted of 10 heavily armed men, Pinkerton agents and former cavalry, moving with the stiff professional discipline of men paid to intimidate. They were camped by a dry riverbed, taking an early, confident breakfast. The leader, Captain Thorn, stood out. He was a man built like a fortress, with a neatly trimmed black beard and eyes that had seen too much war to feel anything but contempt. He wore a tailor-made dust coat over a formidable arsenal, and the polished brass buttons of his uniform gleamed with cruel efficiency. Thorn turned as Elias and Finn stumbled into the camp, looking like refugees. His look of casual annoyance instantly hardened into professional fury. "Vance, you're 2 days late, and you look like you were dragged through a rat's nest," Thorn barked, dropping his coffee cup. "Where are the coordinates? Why aren't you at Station 50? Elias threw himself off his horse, barely steadying himself. He lunged toward Thorn, ignoring the rifle butts that swung up to greet him. "Captain, turn your men around, now! We have to move back to the eastern plains 5 miles minimum," Elias gasped, trying to catch his breath. Thorn was nonplussed. He crossed his arms, the action stretching the heavy leather of his coat. "I take orders from the company, not from exhausted mathematicians, Vance. I am here to secure the right of way. Did you find a problem? A ravine? A flash flood risk?" "I found a war, Captain. I found gold," Elias spat out, leaning in and lowering his voice to a hiss. "The Serpent's Coil is not just a canyon, it's the site of a major independent gold strike, the Copper Queen mine. If the railroad attempts to bury it, the legal battle will bankrupt the GWP for a decade. I have the proof, Thorn, the assay reports." He pulled the folded, oil-stained pages from his coat lining, the thick paper crinkling. "Look at the value. This evidence stops the track cold. We reroute north, use the alternate pass, and save the company millions and avoid triggering a massive territorial conflict." Thorn took the pages, but his eyes never left the horizon. He scanned the dense figures and the geological map with a surprising speed, his expression shifting from anger to genuine, dangerous greed. The silence of the camp tightened around the two men. "A gold strike," Thorn murmured, the word tasting like a forbidden pleasure on his tongue. He looked up, not at Elias, but toward the peaks. "You saw the locals?" "Serafina Cole and the Apache are already tracking us. They think we brought you. "They're using us to lure you into an ambush point," Elias explained urgently. "We need to fall back before they close the trap." Thorn stared at the papers one moment longer, a calculating glint in his eyes. Then, with a curt, brutal motion, he tore the pages in half and dropped the shredded remnants into the dry riverbed. "We don't run from the enemy, we run over them," Thorn said, his voice cold and commanding. "A gold strike means a fight, and a fight means the company needs my protection more than ever. The line runs where the company says it runs, and I'm paid to clear the path, not change the maps. Tie up these fools, men. We march to the coil." Just as two men stepped forward to grab Elias and Finn, the desert itself seemed to exhale. It wasn't the distant drumming of the night before. It was a high, chilling, echoing sound, the Apache war cry, a sound that tasted of raw wind and immediate death. From three sides, the northern ridge, the eastern bank of the riverbed, and a small wooded copse, riders erupted. They were lean, painted for war, moving with silent, terrifying speed. The two trackers Elias had seen were just the vanguard. The main force was already in position. Thorn swore violently. "Damn it! They're fast! Form up! Fire at will!" The patrol exploded into chaotic motion, the sharp crack of modern repeating rifles tearing the morning air. Elias, realizing his desperate gamble had failed, watched in horror as the conflict he had tried to prevent instantly materialized around him. A wave of Apache riders crested the nearest ridge, firing bows and rifles. One of Thorn's men stumbled back, clutching his chest. Elias was no soldier. He saw the fight devolving into a massacre. He saw the shattered paper of the assay reports scattered on the ground. Thorn was lost to battle fever, barking orders and firing his own massive revolver. Elias, the man of precision and measurement, knew that a physical force could not be beaten with data. He had to create a distraction, a brief moment of calculated chaos. He scrambled back to his surveying gear. He grabbed the heavy brass transit, the one instrument that symbolized the entire conflict, the iron horse, the future, and the invasion of this land. With a primal yell that surprised even himself, Elias hefted the heavy, shining brass mechanism, worth more than Finn's entire annual salary, directly into the middle of the gunfight. It crashed on a stack of ammunition crates near Thorn, the loud metallic clang echoing over the gunfire, drawing every eye for a split second. "The line is broken! The survey is void!" Elias screamed, his voice raw with desperation. Thorn, enraged, turned to shoot Elias, but the brief distraction was enough. An Apache rider, riding low over his horse, took the opening. He didn't shoot. He reached out with a long ash spear, hooking the brass transit's tripod and yanking it away, a symbolic victory that momentarily stunned both sides.
Elias grabbed Finn and shoved him toward the cover of a granite outcrop. "We failed to stop it, Finn. Now we survive it. We ride for the company headquarters. We are taking the proof to the very top." The battle raged behind them, but Elias was already mounting his mare. He knew that the line of contact had been established. The Iron Horseman's trail had been christened in blood, and now his only task was to escape the inevitable slaughter and deliver the message that could still save the future. The conflict has officially begun. Elias now has to escape Captain Thorn's deadly indifference and the Apache ambush to reach the Great Western Pacific's headquarters. The sun climbed higher, baking the desert floor and turning the air thick and metallic. Behind Elias and Finn, the sounds of battle, the popping cracks of repeating rifles, mixed with the thin, ragged whoops of the Apache, began to thin out, suggesting one side had gained a gruesome advantage. Elias did not look back. He knew that the moment the fight ended, whether in victory or defeat, the survivors would come for him. He was no longer a surveyor running from a warning. He was a fugitive running from a war he had failed to prevent, and from a captain who had just destroyed evidence of a gold strike. Thorn would label Elias a traitor, a saboteur, or worse, a dead man whose warnings were irrelevant. "They'll be after us, Mr. Vance," Finn choked out, wiping sweat and dust from his eyes. His body trembled with exhaustion, but his fear lent him a desperate energy. "Thorn won't let anyone know he passed on millions for a fight he might lose." "He won't," Elias agreed, his voice rough. "He thinks the gold will be his prize, and he'll fight the Apache and Serafina Cole for it. We have to reach the main railhead. We have to tell the company chairman what Thorn has done." Elias reached inside his coat, feeling for the tattered pages of the assay reports. He felt only the rough lining. Thorn had shredded the summary sheets. But then his fingers brushed against a thicker piece of paper. He pulled it out, the hand-drawn geological map that Serafina had tucked into the ledger. It was covered in charcoal smudges and technical notations. Not the full financial proof, but a damning, tangible piece of evidence showing the depth and complexity of the Copper Queen's vein. "This," Elias muttered, holding the map tight, "is our only witness." They rode northeast, following the original doomed survey line, not because it was the best path, but because it led directly to the company's only reliable means of communication, the telegraph line. After another hour of grueling travel, Elias spotted them. 2 riders, disciplined and deadly, separated from the main battlefield. Thorn's men. They were not Apache. They wore the familiar heavy leather and carried the distinct heavy-caliber rifles of Thorn's security detail. They were gaining steadily, knowing Elias and Finn were riding spent horses. "They're professional trackers, Finn. They'll run us down before noon," Elias said, his mind racing. He had abandoned his transit, his chains, and his stakes. All he had left was his integrity and the ragged map. Ahead, the survey line passed through a narrow bottleneck, a gorge known as the Needle's Eye, where a small half-finished timber bridge spanned a dry ravine. It was the only way across for miles. Elias saw his chance. It was a brutal decision, but necessary. "Finn, when we cross, don't look back. Keep riding until you see the wires of the telegraph. I'll buy us time." They spurred their horses across the shaky wooden planks. Elias stopped his mare just on the other side. He jumped off, pulling the heavy 8-pound sledgehammer he used to drive the corner stakes. The pursuers were now only 300 yards away, their faces grim and determined. Elias ran back to the timber supports of the bridge. With desperate strength, fueled by adrenaline, he began swinging the hammer against the iron bolts holding the bridge's main support beam. Clang, clang, clang. Each blow sent a jarring tremor up his arms. The wood splintered. The iron buckled. One of Thorn's men raised his rifle. Elias knew he had seconds. He delivered one final shattering blow, and the main support beam groaned, shifting out of its mooring. "Ride, Finn! Ride!" he yelled. He scrambled back onto his horse and dug his heels into her flanks. As they galloped away, the bridge gave a terrible splintering shriek. They heard the massive crash as the timbers and planks fell into the ravine below. The abrupt silence that followed was deafening. He looked back and saw the 2 mercenary riders standing at the edge of the chasm, their hands tightly gripping their reins, staring down at the ruined crossing. They were stopped, not permanently, but delayed for hours. The act of calculated destruction, wrecking the bridge, was the final act of a surveyor abandoning his trade for a higher purpose. Elias was no longer laying the path, he was destroying it. By late afternoon, the desperate ride paid off. They reached Dust Bowl Station, a collection of 2 shacks, a water tower, and the tall, silent poles carrying the single most important line in the West, the telegraph line. Elias, stumbling into the tiny, dusty station house, collapsed against the counter. The station operator, a rail-thin man with spectacles, stared at the wild, exhausted mess before him. "I need to send a message, a coded message, immediately, to New York,
To Mr. Alexander Caldwin, chairman of the board, Elias demanded, slamming the geological map onto the counter. He knew his time was short. He had slowed the men down, but he hadn't stopped them. Elias had to use the language of the company, the language of money and power, to relay the truth before Thorne could send his own lies down the line. The truth of the gold, the truth of the Apache, and the truth of the war that was now raging in the Serpent's Coil. Elias Vance, the failed surveyor, was about to send his last desperate and most important survey finding. Elias has sacrificed his professional tools and risked his life to gain this small window of opportunity at the telegraph office. The next chapter will focus on the complex, tense, and urgent process of communicating this crisis to the distant railroad executives.
The Dust Bowl Station telegraph office was stiflingly hot, smelling of stale dust, burnt coal, and the sharp ozone tang of the electrical relays. The operator, a man named Silas, eyed Elias with a mixture of suspicion and pity. He had seen too many frantic men with grand schemes pass through the desert. Elias placed the crumpled geological map on the wooden counter, smoothing out the folds. He knew that a simple message like, "Thorne is starting a war," or "There's gold here," would be dismissed as the rantings of a desert lunatic, intercepted or corrupted. He had to speak the only language the chairman of the Great Western Pacific, Alexander Caldwell, understood, the cold, unassailable language of finance and engineering. "I need to send this message to New York, to the private wire of Mr. Caldwell," Elias instructed, his voice low and tight. "It's a long-form cipher. Every word counts." Silas cranked the generator, the low hum filling the shack. He positioned his hand over the key, ready to tap out the dots and dashes. Elias began to dictate, crafting the telegram not as a plea, but as a meticulously calculated threat. To Alexander Caldwell, Chairman, GWP Rail, New York. Priority, catastrophic capital risk. Subject, survey integrity failure, San Pedro Valley, station 47 to 50. Message commences. 1. 36-hour delay forced. Surveyor unable to continue line placement due to extreme geological instability. Primary route at Serpent's Coil now non-viable. 2. Geological data confirms vein depth 93 feet. Calculated investment in required cut and fill to proceed through coil is estimated at $7,000 per foot, factoring unforeseen strata resistance. Total construction cost through coil exceeds $2.8 million over current budget. This estimate ignores land acquisition. 3. Land acquisition impossible. Local claim is active, heavily defended, and demonstrably profitable. Vein includes high-grade quartz intrusion. Assayed projections indicate independent valuation of resource exceeds $5 million, a figure that will be argued in federal court. 4. Conclusion. Route is terminally impeded. Any attempt to secure the right-of-way will result in full cessation of work and immediate litigation against the GWP for mineral rights interference. The company will be obligated to purchase a mine worth more than the entire regional line construction. 5. Recommendation. Immediate reroute via alternate North Pass. Initiate contact with Chief Engineer in Omaha to authorize line adjustment and abandonment of all resources west of Station 46. 6. Dispatching Officer Captain Thorne has committed to engagement, invalidating survey findings and destroying documentation. His action compromises GWP legal standing and threatens massive unsanctioned military expenditure. 7. Attaching geological map reference, Vance, E. 10.23 1887. Confirm reception and immediate action. End message. As Elias dictated the final word, the sound of the key stopped. Silas looked up, his face pale. The message was so long,
so dense with figures and risk assessment, it had taken nearly half an hour to transmit. That's not a message, Mr. Vance, Silas whispered, wiping sweat from his brow. It's the truth, Silas. The cost of a lie just got too high, Elias said, exhausted. The moment the transmission ended, the small, relative safety of the station evaporated. Outside, a faint thump, thump, thump grew in volume, the steady rhythm of horses at a forced gallop. They were not Thorne's men, who were delayed at the needle's eye, but the Chiricahua, the Apache, seeing the telegraph poles, the symbol of the relentless advance of the Iron Horse, knew exactly where Elias, the man who brought the soldiers, would go next. Elias grabbed the geological map, rolling it quickly. They're here. They saw the smoke from the generator. They're coming for the messenger. Silas was already grabbing a shotgun from under the counter. They never come this close to the wire, not since '83. But they see your dust trail, and they see the wires. They think you're bringing the end of their world. Elias knew the truth of that statement. By sending his urgent, rational message to the east, he had simultaneously cemented his status as the primary enemy of the West. He was the human link between the destruction of the coil and the destruction of the Apache way of life. The line is sent, Silas. Now we wait for the answer, or for the end of the line, Elias said, peering out the dusty window. The riders were visible now, shadows coalescing into men and horses, their movements silent, swift, and deadly. Elias had used the power of civilization to send his warning, but now he had to use his instincts to survive the reaction of the wilderness. The silence was the worst kind of deceit. The drumming horses had stopped just beyond the ragged perimeter of the telegraph station. The Chiricahua were not charging, they were surrounding, moving with the patient, predatory skill of hunters who knew their prey was trapped. Elias flattened himself against the dusty interior wall of the shack, the rolled geological map clutched in his hand. The station was little more than an oversized wooden crate, 2 small windows, a single bolted door, and the essential machinery of the telegraph. "They're not interested in the station, Mr. Vance," whispered Silas, his face pale, but his hands steady as he loaded 2 shells into his antiquated shotgun. "They're interested in what you represent. You are the man who came in on the wire and brought the soldiers behind you." "I'm the man who tried to stop the soldiers, Silas," Elias corrected grimly, looking at Finn, who was huddled under the desk, nursing a sprained ankle but holding his revolver steady. "Keep the door covered, Finn. Silas, focus on the wire. If that key starts clicking, you ignore everything else and get the message down." Thwack! The first arrow struck the wooden wall with a dull impact, sinking a full inch into the dry timber near the window. The fight had begun. Elias saw the flash of movement. A handful of warriors were using the water tower and the coal shack as cover. Their objective was simple: cut the wire and eliminate the messenger. Silas took the first shot. The blast from the shotgun was deafening in the cramped space. It shredded the water barrel on the tank tower, sending a sudden, brief cascade of water down, forcing the warriors concealed there to move. The return fire was immediate, a volley of arrows and a few rifle shots that splintered the window frame. Elias ducked, instinctively pressing the map tighter against his chest. This map, the evidence of millions in gold, was their shield and their hope. He grabbed an empty, heavy battery case and hurled it through the intact side window. The sudden shattering glass drew the attention of one Apache closest to the main telegraph pole. In that instant, Elias fired his own revolver, a quick, desperate shot that missed the man but forced him to drop behind the generator shed. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity, but was only minutes. Elias fought with the ruthless pragmatism of an engineer. He used objects as cover, calculated angles for distraction, and conserved his limited ammunition. Suddenly, Silas's tense silence broke. "The key! It's clicking! They're answering!" Silas, ignoring the arrows that continued to thud into the exterior walls, bent over the receiver, his body shielding the delicate instrument. He was oblivious to everything but the stuttering rhythm of the dots and dashes, translating the urgent language of New York into English. Elias and Finn redoubled their defense, laying down cover fire. The attackers realized the message was paramount. A large, heavily built Apache warrior, wearing a simple leather breastplate, broke cover and charged the front door, his obsidian-tipped spear raised. Elias had one bullet left. He aimed not at the man's chest, but at the door hinge nearest the lock. Bang! The shot shattered the aged, brittle iron of the hinge. The warrior slammed into the door, but the remaining latch held, though barely. The brief pause in the attack was Elias's clue. The warriors had seen the destruction of the bridge, and they had seen the unexpected fierce resistance at the station. They had also seen that the messenger was now communicating. Their tactical goal had been compromised. With a final chilling war cry, the Apache retreated as swiftly and silently as they had come, melting back into the vast, indifferent desert. They had failed to cut the wire or capture the messenger, but they had delivered their own message. The land would not be taken quietly. The dust settled. Elias stumbled to the counter, his ears ringing, his shoulder aching, but alive. Silas was writing the final characters on the thin paper strip, his hand shaking uncontrollably. He tore off the completed telegram and handed it to Elias. The message from Alexander Caldwin, the chairman of the Great Western Pacific, was brutally concise and final. It cut through the miles of wire and the chaos of the West with the cold, impersonal logic of pure capital. Elias read the words. Vance, data confirmed. Cost prohibitive. Contact Omaha Chief Engineer. Route adjustment authorized. Return with map. Thorne pays. The tension drained out of Elias. They had won. The millions in projected costs and the threat of litigation had done what integrity and warning could not. It had stopped the Iron Horse. The Serpent's Coil and the Copper Queen were safe. But the final line, Thorne pays, was not a relief. It was a sentence. Captain Thorne, who had destroyed the summary reports and plunged the canyon into war, would now face the terrifying retribution of his New York superiors. The war was averted, but the reckoning was just beginning. Elias looked at the geological map, now sticky with his own blood, and then toward the western horizon, where the fighting was still simmering. He had a new set of orders. Go to Omaha, deliver the map, and formally reroute the greatest railway project in the nation. He turned to Finn and Silas, the two men who had shared his madness. We ride for Omaha. The East has blinked. Now we just have to survive the consequences of their decision.